Art has always been associated with power. Many times throughout history, artists were seen as having special powers. Artists could envision things and then bring them into being using stone, dirt, ashes. Artists were set apart from ordinary people. The objects they created were a way to communicate and influence other humans. Artists and their artwork were sometimes even considered to be magical. In Chapter 1, we heard about Chinese scholar painters. These artists were highly admired because of their sophistication and knowledge. The Greeks believed the artistic creativity came from one of the 9 sister goddesses called the Muses. The Romans called the artist's guiding spirit the genius, and this carried on to the Renaissance artists, who were considered geniuses in many ways. We've talked about visual literacy and how to decipher the messages that artists have left us. Artists have the power to communicate both positive and negative ideas using the same vocabulary. Art can be used as propaganda, persuasion, it can be used politically, and it can be used for people in power. Propaganda is defined as the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. Now, usually this type of art can be biased or misleading, and it has a lot of hidden messages. And both fine art and mass media can be used as propaganda. Now, persuasion is a nicer term than propaganda because it suggests convincing rather than coercing. Persuasion is interactive, and it attempts to build a bridge between the person who is persuading and the one they are trying to persuade, but it still uses the same imagery. Your text uses fine art pieces to examine this issue of art and power. But I'm going to throw in some of the mass media items that have also been used for propaganda or persuasion. So what do you think about these images? Do you think they're propaganda or persuading? What do you think they're emphasizing? How about these images? Artists can use their genius to make powerful people look even more powerful. Jacques-Louis David was commissioned to be the court artist for the French Emperor Napoleon. David's images portray Napoleon as a larger-than-life person, calm, cool, in charge. Now, Napoleon has a quote that's really very appropriate to our lesson. He said, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." As we talk about some of the other artists and their persuading art, we have to wonder how accurate the portrayals are. Art has always been used to give a historical or a documentary message. But this chapter, we're going to focus more on the imagery of war, because that is a very powerful message and it evokes really powerful emotions. And while art has been used to document most every kind of historical event, war is the most dramatic of those. Art is often created to mark a triumph that gave the leaders the right to rule. This type of art can also be persuasive or coercive. The Narmer palette from the 31st century BC is probably the oldest example of war imagery. Here, King Narmer is exercising his superiority over the enemy. Now, notice that this artwork is using that hierarchical scale where the victor is larger than the enemy. On the right, the image of Washington crossing the Delaware is an artwork that is pretty well romanticized. In other words, it looks better than it actually was. The artist painted this dramatic work 75 years after this battle. So chances are pretty good he took the information of the event and he painted it as he wanted it to be rather than how it actually was. Photography ushered in a new reality when documenting war. It's more difficult to manipulate a photograph than it is to manipulate a painting or a drawing. Now, photography gave most people a very sobering look at the real war. Some photographers even portrayed the horrors of war. The first war images were from the Civil War. Now, because the art of photography was fairly new, there was a lot of equipment to carry and set up. So most of the images are of posed people or of battlefields. Later photographers were able to capture more of a moment in time, such as the flag raising over Iwo Jima and this standoff between the police and an anti-war protester. Now, while photography dominated the anti-war era, some artists still created protest paintings of war. Possibly the best known artwork is Picasso's Guernica. He created this work to protest the bombing of the Spanish town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. Henri Damier created a series of lithographs, which are prints, after the National Guard assassinated innocent citizens that were thought to be part of the uprisings in Paris in 1834. The Vietnam War lasted about 20 years, from around November 1st, 1955 to around April 30th, 1975. By the mid to late 60s, people's patience was wearing out, and this is when the bulk of the anti-war protesting went on. Some of the anti-war sentiment used mass media posters and flyers. Now, first of all, there's a typo in my text on the spelling of iconoclasm. In my text, they're missing the M on the end of the word. Iconoclasm is the deliberate destruction of religious icons or monuments, usually for religious or political motives. Now, the question arises, though, does destroying the imagery erase that history? The Egyptian pharaohs were very good at erasing images of predecessors. Here you can see how they chiseled out the image and the name of the person. Even in contemporary times, this has happened. In 2001, the Taliban basically erased 2 statues of Buddha that had stood since the 6th century BC. The Protestant Reformation led to a lot of iconoclasm. The extreme reformists considered the Catholic Church's images idolatrous. These symbols of the Catholic Church were also considered by many to be symbols of the corruption of the Church. In 2002, a statue of Saddam Hussein was erected in Firdos Square in Baghdad. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, and on April 9, 2003, almost 1 year from its erection, the statue was torn down by the Iraqi citizens with the help of the U.S. military. On June 10, 2020, this statue of Christopher Columbus was torn down at the Minnesota State Capitol to protest the fact that Columbus was abusive to the indigenous peoples of this country. Today, pretty much any statue or remembrance of anything Confederate from the Civil War is being taken down or vandalized because of the issue of slavery in the South.